The other ones are Fabian and Martin. Thank you that I don't need to do it alone. Um, First of all, we are using Slido. You can see it on my screen for Q&A. So if you have any questions, go there and put it there. Fabian added the link to the chat. And I also want to thank you, our sponsor, Jumio, Wilhelm, and Trigio. Okay. They're always searching for new employees. So if you need a new job or want to change, contact them. And yeah, today we will talk, or we will hear a talk about documenting your architecture and introduction to arc42. I'm really looking forward because I use arc42, or I used it for several projects. And I'm really looking forward to what Savvas Kleanthous has to talk about it. And without wasting our time, I will ask Savvas Kleanthous to take over and start the presentations. And yeah, have fun. And yeah, Savvas, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you, Hans.
Okay, then I will stop the sharing and you can take over. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Just a second.
Yeah,
Can't everybody see my screen?
I can see it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So, hello everyone, and thank you to DDD Vienna and Microservices Reactive Vienna meetups as well for having me today. My name is Savvas Kleanthous. I'm the head of engineering at Parcel Vision at the UK, and today I'm going to be speaking about arc42. Before we begin, this talk is basically split in three sections. The first section is an introduction to arc42 and a little bit of a summary from my personal experience with architectural documentation and other kinds of architectural documentation. What are the problems that I faced in my career with that interactions, and how does arc42 come to address this? And before we going into a presentation of the different sections that arc42 has and what how you are supposed to be using each different section. And finally, I'm going to be speaking a little bit about arc42 in different contexts. So that specifically means so taking or using arc42, for example, in a startup environment and so on and so forth, just to see and discuss a little bit about how you can adapt arc42 to meet your different needs and requirements and environments. So without further ado, what is arc42? I tried to distill the description of arc42, and basically arc42 is a template for architectural documentation. It's supposed to be accessible and easy to use to author your documentation for an architecture. I think it's equally useful to understand what arc42 isn't. Some confusion that I've seen with a lot of people that I have discussed with, at least when they started reading about things, is that arc42 isn't supposed to be an architecture. arc42 isn't necessarily an enterprise tool. So it's very, very accessible, and it's simply just a template to help you guide you towards a bit of success, so to speak, from the perspective of architectural documentation. It's definitely not a silver bullet. So you will see that, I mean, it doesn't solve all of your problems necessarily, but it does help you quite nicely by having that structure. We're going to be speaking a little bit later about all of those different sections that it has and why those provide some benefit. So the question then becomes, should you use arc42 compared to something else? This is where I just wanted to go through a different, so my experiences and the journey that I had in different positions that I held in the past. And by a very large margin, my most frequent experience with architectural documentation is not having any available to me. That didn't matter if I worked as a software developer. I also held some positions with as team lead in some cases. That again, I didn't have any access to any documentation whatsoever. So I'm not speaking about documentation of the source code of the solution that we actually had, a documentation of the architecture itself and the problems that we were trying to solve. There was simply no documentation available to us. If there was some documentation in that company, we were not available to this. So I'm sure you can understand that this is definitely a problem. As developers and as team leads, we're supposed to develop a solution and implement certain features and meet certain requirements from our users, and not having access to the forces at play, what our competitors are doing, how are they fulfilling those needs, what are their customers, what are our customers' needs, is definitely problematic. You can get a little bit of a glimpse into some of this information, either by speaking to some of the, I don't know, some of the testers, or potentially from time to time we could do some user reviews, but this is definitely still not an official documentation of somebody that did an analysis to discover all of the forces at play. After this, my other experience, my next more frequent experience, especially in startups, but that's not to be that it's limited to startups. I experienced the same thing in enterprise environments, is that there was an abundance of information, but there was no clear structure, and it was not compiled into a single document that somebody could read through and understand what's going on. It was either comments in code here and there, some tickets in Jira, some documentation in Confluence. So it was, the information was there, but it was a significant amount of effort to actually even discover all of those different parts of the of the information that you needed. And again, it's really useful to have all of that in your head when you're working on a particular solution, because those define what decisions you can make, of course. But not having is a big problem, and even those glimpses that are available in some cases still are not helpful when you're moving and trying to work on different parts of your system. Another experience that I had, this was mostly on larger enterprises and established companies, is that each team got a glimpse of the documentation, only what was deemed useful for that particular team. So in a lending company, when you were working on the underwriting team, providing the platform for underwriting, you would only get the documentation that related to you. So potentially you had an idea of the teams next to you and what they were doing, what are the requirements that they had. So maybe the picture I used for this slide, maybe not the perfect one. We had the next pieces to yours as well, but that's about it. You definitely still had no idea of what was going on as a bigger picture. Maybe you had an idea of the product, of course, because we were working on it, but you didn't know what other guiding forces existed there. Again, I'm sure you can understand how this is also quite problematic. And finally, there were a few exceptions where, as a team lead in this case, I had access to the entire documentation. And I don't know if you worked in bigger enterprises that got to have grants or to apply for grants. You have to have accompanying documentation with regards to exactly how you're going to be implementing this solution in order to get a grant, at least for some larger government products, government grants. And in those cases, that documentation was immense. The documentation is being there was a huge benefit compared to all of the previous situations that I explained, but this was still problematic again. So I don't remember exactly what was the format. The documentation had a specific format. It wasn't arc42, but it was quite problematic because it was extremely detailed in parts that were irrelevant to a lot of the audience that document was supposed to be read from, and it lacked details in others. It certainly didn't help internal consumers of that document. So within the company, that document provided little help. So again, not a very good experience. Now, finally, just as a wedge that I would like to mention is that because this is something that I'm seeing, especially nowadays, with a lot of companies that are, again, not really making an effort on the documentation side of things, but instead they do keep a set of diagrams around. The problem is, as Grady Butch says in his tweet, is that a diagram is simply just one perspective of the system. So it may be a useful perspective for sure, but it's just one of those aspects. And keeping around different diagrams may not necessarily give you a complete picture of the system that you are building. I've personally found that indeed diagrams are really useful to convey that perspective, but text is also invaluable in a lot of cases, and you shouldn't be you shouldn't avoid writing any some piece of text. So arc42 then is really an attempt to fix all of these things, and to my experience at least, it does succeed. So it does succeed in doing so. Arc42 is an accessible template. It's an accessible because it's, first of all, it's just some titles. I mean, if you download the template, that you will see that it has titles for each section and subsection to help you guide you to fill them in. But there are no strict rules about what you put into each section, how detailed you go about it, and whether you should fill everything or skip some things. You are supposed to complete what makes sense for you and your context, for your system and the situation that you are in. In a startup, you will potentially put more emphasis into different sections of a document than when you are in an enterprise. If you are in a solution that is very automated with a lot of that happening in software versus one solution that is a combination of manual workflows and automated workflows, again, the emphasis will be different in those different situations. But as a template, you are able to use this in all of these different environments. It's low ceremony again because it doesn't need a lot of things added into it. If all of your needs can be met by some diagrams and a little bit of text, you are free to do so. If you don't care about some of those sections because those are not important to the situation that you're currently in, you are free to skip it. So generally, it's quite easy both to fill an arc42 template in the first place, and because you are mostly documenting the important decisions there, it's also quite easy to maintain going forward. It's thorough in a sense that there are sections about pretty much everything that is important in a system, and by having those titles and by having the practice of going through each and every one, and even if you skip it, just consider whether it makes sense for your particular context to add a little bit of information on that section. It's quite thorough, and it's extensible by the mere fact that you could adapt a particular section to meet your particular requirement. So there aren't any strict rules, as I said. So basically, what I wanted to make sure that I convey is that you have those different sections and those titles as a template. Use it. So write as much or as little as you need, basically, in order for this to be maintainable going forward. So that's about the introduction to arc42. And now for this section, the official webpage for arc42 and basically the book that was released about arc42 made the choice to introduce arc42 in this using examples from different situations. So there are, in the book, for example, there are 5 different chapters, each one presenting one particular document that they were allowed to present. And it's quite useful, I have to say. So it's a lot of information there. If you don't have that book and you are interested in, I highly recommend you buying that book. It's really easy to read as well, and it will give you enough information. But because that page and that document is already presented in the form of examples, And because of my experience, especially when I started, the problems that I faced was I kept finding myself asking the question of, so what do I put here exactly? So yeah, I can see the examples, but what about my situation? So what do I put there? So I decided to go section by section and just give you an introduction of what should go there in general. So it's going to be an overview of each section. So I'm going to be presenting like broad guidelines, but I hope it's a good complement to the examples that are already available to you in arc42. So without further ado, section 1, introduction and goals. So introduction and goals, I from personal experience, this is one of the most important um, sections in of arc42, and at the same time, it's the most common piece of information that is missing from other architectural documentations. So what I tend to do is I dedicate a lot of time in this particular section, and I like to make sure that I really like what is there. And I also make sure that it's not too much information. I usually fill in about 1 or 2 pages for this, although I'm sometimes I do put some more information there depending on the situation, but I always make sure that it's easy to read in one sitting. I make sure that I provide an introduction to the company, an introduction to the environment that we are in, an overview of the requirements, just the important ones. So I'm not just, this is not a list of all of the requirements that we have, but just that providing the necessary context, the most important quality goals that we have of our system, and important stakeholders. Again, not everyone, just important people in this at the particular situation. So again, this is just providing context. I like to give this particular section to somebody not in the tech department to read, just so that they can read it and confirm to me that they understand what this section is about. Because really, this section should be able, you should be able to give this to anyone who is joining the company, so that they can understand what you are building, so what the product that you're building is, what it's supposed to be doing, and what's the environment that the company is in. Definitely use diagrams if you want here. So if you're finding the textual narrative is a little bit too much, and you can use some diagrams to better convey the message that we are trying to do. Use that. Use tables for the stakeholders if that makes more sense. So if it's instead of who is the stakeholder of what as a piece of text, if you want to create a short table and better convey this information or make it more searchable, absolutely do that. But definitely keep this short, keep this to the point, and avoid going into too much details. Again, this is an introduction that everybody should be able to read. So next section are the architectural constraints. Architectural constraints are basically forces that we should not, or basically for section 2, these are the forces that we must not simply ignore. That's not to say that we are documenting the stuff that we absolutely have to adhere to, but it may be something that is very, very important. So this may be the situation like, so one example of this is everyone in the development team that we have, and we have, I don't know, maybe 30 developers, they are all familiar with C#, for example, and they have like no knowledge of any other software language. I'm not trying to like make any comment about C# developers. By the way, I came from being a C# developer, but just taking as an example that this is not something that we can simply ignore when we are making architectural decisions. So that is a constraint that we have. Another constraint may be that we have paid a very large amount of money for a particular license, and our CTO just will not accept us not using that particular product. So here, as I said, these are the constraints in general. So it's called architectural constraints because the architecture touches everything. So depending on who you speak with, the architectural decisions are basically all important decisions that can be made into a system. And similar to that, these are constraints that are constraining any aspect of the system. There are 3 major categories here: environmental constraints, political and organizational constraints, and technical constraints. So these are not the only ones. If you have any other kinds of constraints that you can think of in your particular situation, absolutely write them. But these are the stuff that you need to consider. Definitely do not skip the political and or organizational constraints. Those are in fact some of the more important constraints that you can have in your system, and in the more constraints of your architecture. And Conway's law, of course, states that, and well, demonstrates that the business, the structure of the business is usually reflected in the software, and that is something that you cannot simply ignore. Section 3, context and scope. The context and scope basically contains an overview of your system as a whole. Now, I'm a bit I forgot to mention, so I should have another bullet point here, that context and scope is basically split into two different parts. So first of all is the business context, and then secondly, we have the technical context as subsections to section 3. Um, we basically provide a little bit of information regarding our system as a whole, as a really, really high level. In the technical context, for example, we are going to be seeing where our system lives, along with its neighbors and its users. So this is where we will be focusing about who depends on us, who we depend upon, who our users are, how all of those different services and users are communicating with us, and what kind of information are going back and forth. So we're not looking about a dynamic view or an interactions diagram or anything like that. We are really looking at a really high level, an overview of the system. If you are familiar with C4, this is the C4 system context diagram. And the C4 system context diagram, in fact, actually really, really well fits into the technical context. And in the business context, you will be providing a lot of information about, well, more information about your product, your competitors, and what kind of forces does the particular domain that you are in is working on. So, for example, that you are in a lending company and you are providing well, loans. You will be documenting here that that there is a trend that mortgages, for example, are like becoming less and less popular, and so on and so forth. Just positioning your company in the environment that you are in, along with some information about your competitors. So one thing that I will certainly say, so as I said before, C4 system context diagram really fit here. But another thing that again, there should be a bullet here to mention that, is that Wordly maps also really, really well fit into this particular section in the business context. Business model canvas also fits really well here, and basically any other modeling artifacts that you think are good to convey this. So one example of an additional modeling artifact that fits here is domain storytelling, for example. Is really useful to provide an information of how things are working. Next up is the solution strategy. This is a solution strategy. So in the previous 3 sections, we have provided the context and some summary of the approach that we're going to be, all of the forces and interactions of the really high level. So how we see the system being used, basically. So solution strategies here is the first section where we are actually making and documenting the decisions that we're making. Previously, it's just analysis and perspective of how things are and how things are going to be working. And this is really how we see our particular product working. It's a summary of the important decisions, as I write there, of the system. But it's important to note that this is not supposed to be an ADR, okay? So this is just really the more important decisions about that. So if we had some particular constraint that we want to do, and we are saying we are making the decision that we're moving away from self-hosting and we're moving into the cloud, that is definitely a very important architectural decision. It definitely makes sense to be put here. Now, I find it very useful that all of the decisions that are documented here I very often link them back and link them forward. So I link them back to the restrictions that we had previously, for example. So just those to explain why certain of those decisions have been made. But also I like to link them forward to all of the subsequent sections, which is more expanding on the actual decisions that we made here. So this is a summary of the decisions that we're making. I personally, I usually find that section 4 is again really important, but I usually tend to keep it small. As I said, this is just the important bits. Now, next up is basically the building blocks view. But before I start explaining on the building blocks view, I would like to just take a second and mention that the first 4 sections basically form a one part of arc42. There are, at least in my opinion, I found that arc42 is split into three pieces. So the first 4 sections provide a summary of context and a very high level overview of your system. So that basically you can give this to almost everyone in a company and they will have a very good idea of what's going on. That may be from the point of view of the guiding force in your system, but it's also, as I mentioned earlier, the important architectural decisions. And it's really useful for everyone to basically know that. It doesn't matter if they're working on support or if they're working on a particular domain. So if you are in a lending company, maybe you have some underwriters, it's useful for them to know how the whole system works. In a similar way that if you are a developer in one particular team, it's useful to know how the rest of the teams are working and what they are trying to achieve. So it's helpful in trying to get you to work towards the same goal. So with that, section 5 is the first section of the second part of arc42, where we are going to be seeing some of the concrete decisions that we're making and how the decisions are going to be implemented. Building blocks view, as the title implies, and this is kind of a theme in arc42, the very descriptive titles, is a static view of the system. We're going to be starting in subsections of arc42. We're going to be starting from the system view. So again, that C-level, the C4 system level view, where our system again is represented by a small box. So diagrams really work well in this particular section, along with neighboring systems. So systems that depend on us and systems that our system depends upon, along with users as well. And then we're going to be diving a little bit deeper, so opening up the black box that is our system in the systems view level and opening it up to see the services that make up our system. So in level 1, all of the services that we have will be represented as black boxes, and we're supposed to be seeing our entire environment, our entire system, and the services that are made up of that, and how do these depend and communicate. And then for the important ones of those services, we are going to be picking them up and opening them up and seeing internally how they are made up of. And now that is the level 2 set of diagrams. You could actually go even deeper. So picking up a component and documenting a little bit about the code, how it's made, how it's supposed to be implemented. But generally, I would advise against doing that. So if you start documenting code, which you can if you find that it's quite important, but if you start adding code in here, you will notice that this becomes a document that you will need quite a lot of effort to maintain. So regardless, this is not about arc42, of course. Whenever you are starting to document code, you will find yourself needing to change it quite often. So as I'm sure, if you are familiar with C4 diagrams, as I'm sure you have noticed, these relate very well in the 3 different levels, 4 different levels that section 5 is mostly made up of. And that basically is that we have the systems view, we have the containers, the container view, and the component diagrams that really fit well on the system level 1 and level 2. If diagrams alone are fine for your use case, definitely feel free to use diagrams alone. personally, I have found that the diagrams are accompanied with some text to explain how each different black box at different level is supposed to be working. It provides like is immensely more helpful. I tend to use tables in a lot of cases. So for example, if we are on level 1, for the services that I'm not going to be opening up and showing their internal components, for those especially, I will have a table to document some of the more important parts of them, of how they're supposed to be working, and describe them in a little bit more detail. Um, as an example, I don't know how visible this is, but this is supposed to be so this is taken from the arc42 section 5 documentation, and it shows these 3 different levels. So the system level, where we're seeing one user interacting with our system depending, communicating bidirectionally with another one, and then our system informing another system. Level 1, as I explained earlier, we're opening up the black box that was our system in that system level, and we're seeing the services that it's made up of. Again, all of them as black boxes at this level. And then we are opening each one of those, well, so the important ones of those, and we're treating them as white boxes and seeing internally what components they are made up of. So the important components that make up of. So you don't have to necessarily stick with the terminologies of services as in executables that are running necessarily. So especially with domain-driven design, we have bounded context that we could replace a service with, if that makes more sense and it's conveying the right level of information again. So again, feel free to adapt it in your particular context, but basically the point is information hiding. At this different level, you're providing a different type of information to the people that are reading this documentation. So at level 1, for example, it's important to see the bigger moving parts. So stuff that are owned by teams of developers or teams in the business, and how do those interact together, where in level 2, when we're drilling in, it's the important components that those services are made up of. And finally, again, with section 5, so how do I basically use section 5 with DDD? As I mentioned, we in domain-driven design we have bounded contexts, which are very hard boundaries in different parts of our system. I will definitely suggest that you mark those explicitly in those diagrams. Well, and as I explained earlier, it makes more sense on level 1. Definitely consider a bounded context canvas as part of that, or adding that in addition to the rest of the diagrams, if that helps you. And then the aggregate design canvas as well as a level 2. So as a component, if again, that makes more sense to you. If the way that you have approached it, if the components that are on level 2 are too big to include the aggregate design canvas, that will fit into a level 3 on arc42 documentation. Now, where section 5 was the static view, section C is now the dynamic aspect, the dynamic view of your system. So here we're focusing a lot on interactions. So how do things communicate internally? How do the data flows within your system? So here on this particular section, we want to document use cases that we are supporting. We want to document important workflows that we have in our system, interactions, data flows across, and don't forget to include any of the important subpaths. So when I mention subpaths, as I'm sure you're aware of, there are an immense number of subpaths in your own company or in your own product, but it's useful to document here some of the important and named ones in your domain. So it depends on what company you are working on, what kind of domain you have. Some of the subpaths have are recognizable. Those are the kind of the subpaths that you want to document. So avoid taking these ad paths as is understood in tech, focus more about how they are perceived by your domain experts. So for example, that will be issuing the wrong invoice for somebody to pay. So that's, we don't undo that kind of thing by just like canceling the invoice. Usually we have to flag it as I forget the term now. So we can flag it as invalid. We need to inform our customers that we sent them an invoice that this was that was wrong, and we need to issue a new invoice. We need to send back. If there was a payment, we need to undo this. So there is a specific workflow that happens when we're doing something like that, and that's the kind of workflows that I'm describing that needs to be here in the perspective of SAT paths. I found that the process level event storming really sits well here, as well as any user story mapping, a more detailed user story mapping as well, to provide a very good perspective of this particular section. As I mentioned before, as it's shared with all of the other sections, definitely focus on the important ones and don't try to go into too much detail. It's very useful to have documentation, but it's less useful when you have to put an increasing amount of effort to maintain it. It starts becoming, well, no matter what you do, unless you have dedicated people supporting this documentation, you will end up with stale information. So focusing on the important ones will help you make sure that it's something that you can support and that it does provide the necessary value to these people reading this. Deployment view is one of the most commonly common types of documentation, architectural documentation that I have found. So in one of my early slides that I was explaining, so what I had the chance to see, especially in Northern enterprises, one of the things that was there, if there was any documentation, it usually was documentation about deployments. So how do we put stuff? Where do we put stuff? So how it is deployed? What kind of communication do those virtual machines or physical machines have? The firewalls, where traffic comes through and goes and returns back to our users. So that kind of thing. And that was kind of always there. And this is the section where this lives. I really like that it's section 7 rather than section 1, because I think all of the previous ones, well, maybe this is because of advances in the technologies and IT sector, but those I consider them to be vastly more important for the success of a product rather than whether we are hosting on a physical machine or a virtual machine or something else. So definitely some of the products that we're using stand to benefit from making a choice versus the other. But realistically speaking, we need to focus on the features and the requirements and quality goals that we have rather than we need to host on using this particular technology. So this here is where we are documenting, as I mentioned, the deployment view. So that's how we deploy, how do software maps to hardware, if that makes sense in our case. So if we're not virtualizing, for example, so it's what piece of software goes where. And feel free to have multiple levels of this. So deployment view is really useful in a lot of cases just to give a context for to a lot of the different teams building this product. So for example, again, from the lending company or of whatever company, doesn't matter. We have different teams working together. So it maybe the underwriting team doesn't care where fulfillment are working on, for example, and but it's useful to at least have a perspective that they are being hosted on the same server, for example, or something like that. Now, the different levels that I'm referring to is that it's useful usually to have like an overview of the system, but being able to drill down on individual servers and be able to see some more information about what is actually on a machine, rather than seeing an overview of we have a group of VMs here, a group of VMs there, and a group of VMs there. Depending. I mean, if you don't find this useful, again, you don't have to. But I do find some use in segregating those pieces of information, but still having them available. One final note is that the deployments view, so what you are hosting on, can very nicely lead again back to some of the quality goals that you have. So if you need scalability, for example, this needs to be reflected here. And being able to link from this to the quality goals is useful as well. So concepts. Now, this is definitely one of my favorite sections, and one that when I saw arc42, this is one that really pleasantly surprised me. I'm going to be skipping this page for now and going here to Fred Brooks. I don't know who's familiar with Fred Brooks. If we are in the same room, I will be asking for hands up just to get an idea of who is familiar. But I really love this quote. So it basically says that I will contend that conceptual integrity is the most important consideration in system design. It is better to have a system omit certain anomalous features and improvements, but to reflect one set of design ideas, that to have one that contains many good but independent and uncoordinated ideas. So I don't know how many of you had that kind of experience, but especially in startups where we have different teams not particularly communicating with each other, and at the same time being given a lot of technical freedoms, you will see, well, at least it's my consistent experience that many things got rediscovered across the same company multiple times. So you will be seeing that there are patterns. So one team will be doing, I don't know, like let's say dependency injection in a particular way, and they abstract it away or whatever. It doesn't matter. Just an example, as I mentioned. And then you will be seeing that the next team is doing exactly the same thing, and then the team a little bit afterwards, they're doing exactly the same thing or quite similar to that. And they all have libraries that they are supporting to for that particular section, and all of them are repeating that amount of effort. So it maybe the example I gave is not the exactly the best one, but being able to at least have this kind of understanding is really important, because for multiple reasons, in fact. So one of those reasons is that, first of all, lessons that you learn in one team can be shared across. If we are sharing a list of patterns, well, basically that concepts is that's what they are referring. They are referring to patterns in our system, and that can be like patterns in code or patterns in the perspective of software patterns, so how components work together. So how do we do one particular thing? So lessons about one particular pattern can be shared across, and we don't have to repeat the mistakes that one team has done across the board, because there is that lack of communication and that lack of enforcement of those patterns across the company. So this is really useful. This is really, really useful. And aside from those transferring of lessons, we are also gaining from the fact that we can actually move from one team to the next. And so we can share our knowledge on different aspects, but still start working on a piece of code that is fundamentally familiar to us. So if we are doing certain things the same way, we are actually able to do this. We can move to another team, learn a little bit about the context, and the code will start working with us. We won't be doing unexpected things. So that's why I'm saying here, these are cross-cutting concerns of what we will be doing. If you have a particular approach with how you are dealing with message handling in asynchronous communications, for example, this is a prime candidate to put here. If you are dealing with if there is a special way that you are adding metadata to your messages, again, this is something that you can put here. If there is a particular architectural pattern that you are using, again, something to put here. So I would definitely recommend, especially if you are not just a single team in the company working together, this is something that you want to put some emphasis in. And as I mentioned on my last dot here is, this is probably the only section where source code makes a lot of sense. Well, if it's on that level. Section 9, architectural decisions. So as I explained earlier, we had a section that was specifically for the important decisions. This is where we're documenting, well, most of them. Again, we don't want to document all of them. They are not ADRs. They do relate to ADRs. So these are architectural decisions, important architectural decisions. But this is not a section where we keep historical ones as well that we decided to abandon for some reason and replace with some new architectural decisions. You should be documenting the important ones, but it's basically an overflow from the different sections. Again, focus on the expensive decisions here. If there are some decisions that are cheap to change, that's definitely something that you can delegate to either all of the individual development teams, and that's fine. So you don't want, as I mentioned before, repeatedly, this is not a document that we want to keep updating. It's better to have something that is providing the right amount of context, revisit from time to time, but not something that you want to just have this on a daily basis so that it doesn't get out of date. A final tip is, if there are some decisions that closely relate to some of the previous sections, definitely prefer to put those decisions where they make sense. So here is just something that is stuff that are globally applying. If you have something that specifically relates to a static view of your system or one of the static components, it probably fits on level 2 of section 5, where it actually applies. So as an architect, you know what is more important. This is your choice, but definitely cause and effect is really useful to be on the same page. So while reading, you read the cause, you read the effect, you understand why something, a particular decision was made in a particular way. Quality goals, basically, is this section. This is, we're going through all of the different quality requirements that we have, all of the goals that we have from the perspective of quality, all of the quality scenarios. And I don't know if you're familiar with the quality attribute utility tree. This is something that I learned relatively recently, by the way. But this is where this kind of information is belongs, basically. We're going to be expanding a little bit about these quality goals, and it's really useful when we can link those goals to the stakeholders specifically that are that those quality goals are attached to. So if there is a particular, I don't know, we have a particular stakeholder in underwriting that they have certain expectations out of the system, definitely link this to there. Because if we need to make any kind of decision, any localized decisions, and it's affected, or if we stand to benefit by violating a specific quality goal, having these links here, so as a record, can help us find out what kind of people do we need to speak to. And it becomes more evident how useful this is by considering that a lot of the decisions that we're making, any tweaks that we're going to be making, or the architectural decisions, usually tend to have an effect on multiple quality goals. It's very rarely that we are only affecting a single quality goal by big changes in our system. So this will help us get sign off from the people that will get affected. And having that sign off, by the way, is a really important if you are going to be making a case for changing something big. That's it. It's an important section, but again, this is not something that is particularly large. Risk and technical debt. This is pretty self-explanatory, I would assume. This is, if you're familiar with a risk registry, this is a place where you can, again, document that here. The only tip that I have here is, again, link it with stakeholders. And finally, the last section of arc42 is the glossary. So the glossary is, so this is the only section that I'm a little bit sad to see it being last, because I think it's really, really important. So the people from domain-driven design um, will be familiar with the ubiquitous languages, and this is a place where you're supposed to put the ubiquitous language. And now, in the examples that you will be seeing about arc42, generally you have like a table of terms, and it makes sense. And I will still suggest that you have a table of the public terms, because very often we have internal language in our components, but there is a public language that different services that depend upon us use in order to do that. It happens, but it's kind of rare to see the internal language, especially when there are conflict in those languages, see those conflicts exposed out. But regardless, this is where you can document the external language, but also document the internal language and link it to the relevant bounded context. So that should link to the sections 5.1. Be specific with the terms. When you are writing something, be specific in the sense of, when you're writing something, provide the context. If it's a public term, so if it's a part of your public language, clearly indicate that and explain what the public language term means. If you are having, so if it's an ubiquitous language of a particular bounded context, document that clearly and explain what that means in that language. Definitely put conflicting terms close to each other. So, for example, loan in acquisition and loan in payments means something different. Put them next to each other and explain why they are different. What are the differences? Focus on that. Absolutely. It helps a lot. arc42 in different contexts. First of all, with domain-driven design. So as I was mentioning before, arc42 is adaptable. You can use it in different contexts, and it's entirely orthogonal with domain-driven design. It doesn't affect you positively or negatively, so you can use it within domain-driven design. arc42 in and of itself doesn't cater specifically for some of the artifacts that we have when we're using it in a domain-driven design context. But there are definitely sections that each and everything we are doing nicely fits. So as I explained earlier, I tried earlier, sorry, to explain the intent of each different sections, what is supposed to be going there. Anything that you are doing has a clear place. If we can discuss this later on if you want to. If you have any questions about a particular thing, where it does it fit, I'm very happy to convey some of my experiences. And if you find that there are gaps, if there is something that you want to document in addition to what is part of there, feel free to expand the sections to have that information, to add that information. Now, as an architectural documentation, one of the questions that I got is that does it really make sense? And also I got a couple of comments from speaking face to face with some people that, architectural documentations doesn't really make sense, or is too much effort for smaller organizations. I will say that arc42 and other kinds of architectural documentation, lean architectural documentation, definitely and absolutely makes sense. So I've very often joined companies, especially smaller ones, that had decided not to document their architecture. It's a nightmare to get onboarded. I don't know if you had different experiences. If you have, please, let's have a discussion afterwards. But personally, when I had documentation, it was easy. When I didn't, it was quite difficult. If you have technical documentation, it helps indeed with onboarding. So you don't need like a very big architectural documentation to get started. But being able to build and run tests is one thing, but being able to contribute meaningfully into building the product or the part of the product that you are working on is a different ballpark. So having that documentation really helps. Now, as I said, with tips, make it lean. Definitely do not try to fill in all sections. Fill in the sections that you makes more sense to you. I will definitely say focus on sections 1, 2, and 3, and potentially then just skip 4 and fill in 5 and 6. So those are kind of the minimum that I would recommend. But those 5 sections still provide quite a lot of information. You can add to that documentation as time goes on, and you can you get a better understanding of, or if some stuff become more or less important. But that is a good starting point at least, and it's still much better than not having anything. Another point, again, experienced a lot with smaller companies and organizations and startups. When there isn't any architect, or there isn't someone wearing the architect hat, do you do architectural documentation? Well, I will still say yes, for exactly the same kind of reasons that I explained earlier. So you only stand to benefit by having something. If there is no architect there, you're still making architectural decisions. It makes sense to document them for either posterity or for somebody who is going to be joining and needs to get an understanding of that. And with that, I'm finished. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the talk.
Thank you, Savvas. It was very interesting. Do you want to have a short break, or should we start with the questions? It's your decision.
I think I'm fine to have to continue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a couple of questions. I will start with the first one. What is a good strategy to make sure architecture documentation doesn't get outdated?
Well, first is the thing that I kept repeating in my presentation, and I really do mean it. You, as an architect, or whoever is being the architect or wearing the architect hat, focus on the important bits first and foremost. I know that it's so. I don't know about everyone, but at least when I started doing this, and or when the team that I was in collectively started doing this, writing architectural documentation. I mean, there were a lot of people that had the need to fill this in with as much as information as possible. So try to avoid that. Focus only what is important. Things that may change in a little bit are probably things that you don't want to document there. Document things that are complex or expensive to change. Focus again on the, if there is something that is easy to change but important for other reasons, do document that. But really, you have to have a very high bar about what is important and what isn't important. So if that alone is quite useful to make sure that you have something that is maintainable. And the other aspect as well is try to see if you can skip some of those sections. So if some sections don't really make sense for you because either you are one team working on a single product, or for whatever other reasons you may want to, you don't think that you will benefit particularly from one of those sections of arc42, feel free to drop it. It's quite often, in fact, for me personally, that I skip one or two sections.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, what tools do you use? Confluence plus Cliffy, or something like AsciiDoc plus Plant UML, or different things, different tools?
Yeah. So if I'm allowed a shameless plug here, so what I found that works really best for me is I use Git. So all of the documentation, all of the documentation that we use is in Git, and that includes arc42. We have arc42. We use Plant UML for most of the diagrams that for all, in fact, of the diagrams that we use on arc42. And I have created a Plant UML scheme. So I have an open source project on GitHub, if you are interested, that allows you to use the Plant UML native controls to theme your diagrams in C4, in the C4 colors, so that you can convey the right context if you want to. Yeah, that's if you want to use it. But yeah, so Markdown in Git and Plant UML for the diagrams. I find it really useful in general to, I find that combination to be really useful.
Okay, thank you. By the way, on the arc42 homepage, there are also templates in different languages for creating the arc42 architecture, like Markdown templates or Confluence templates, I think, and so on.
Yep, indeed.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, which arc42 sections tend to be 20% of documentation effort, but provide 80% of documentation value? Or put it differently, which sections do you look up most often?
I think that, so the most often used pieces of documentation are probably the first three. So as I mentioned, I tend to share those with everyone. So whenever anyone joins a particular product, they get to read that, and just so that they understand what's happening, what's going on. Now, for the different sections, it kind of depends. There's definitely a lot of information on section 5 to 6 and 7, and well, and the concepts are the conceptual integrity are quite important. I don't know about how. So I think from the perspective of conceptual integrity specifically, this is something that is definitely worth a lot of effort. I don't know about the documentation side of it. So actually having it to read specifically, but putting an effort on the conceptual integrity bit is definitely very, very helpful. So that is something that I will definitely suggest people to do. But overall, I will say 1, 2, and 3 really, really important. The static view and the dynamic view is equally very, very important, and conceptual integrity are so. If you want to focus on a subset, that will be my starting point. I don't know if I answered that question.
Yeah, I mean, for me, you answered it, but the question was not from me, so.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, how would you start when you are already in the middle of a project and don't really remember all the decisions you have made so far? It's a good one.
It's a good one indeed, and it's a little bit of a tricky one too. Yeah, so it happened to me a couple of times. So first of all, my suggestion is don't feel intimidated by this. You are definitely not the first person to be in that position, and you are definitely not going to be the last. Especially startups that I have, I worked with, all of them without exception started without an architectural documentation. So somebody at some point started writing it. As I said, start writing, refine periodically, and you will end up at some point in a situation that makes sense. I mean, that's the core of Agile, right? I mean, we're building something based on some requirements. We are eliciting feedback, improving, eliciting feedback, improving, eliciting feedback, improving. So really, my tip there is make sure that somebody is reading that from time to time. It can be just you for a bit, but definitely involve other people as soon as you can. And that, I mean, it will not be perfect from day one, but at some point soon it will be good, especially after you are seeing your system working in production and start seeing how it breaks as well in some cases, and you will be discovering all of the guiding forces that exist. Okay, so that definitely, but the good tip also is doing wordly maps. So if you're the guiding forces, the context, and those larger decisions about why some things are some way can usually be discovered really well when you are doing wordly maps.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, at what granularity level would you document technical debt?
Sorry, can you repeat? I didn't.
At what granularity level would you document technical debt?
At what kind of clarity level? Sorry.
Would you document technical debt?
I'm still not understanding. I apologize.
Granularity.
At what granularity level will you document? Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, so well, again, we don't want to have things that are we don't want to create maintenance effort for us in general. So if only document enough information for people to understand what's going on, and only if it makes sense to be documented. So if there is a technical debt that can be fixed within like 1 week of effort, for example, it may be not something that you want to document. If you want to keep a record of these things, absolutely do so. It's just that it's not probably something that belongs in arc42. In arc42, it may be technical debt that is difficult to change, or that it requires a significant amount of re-architecture. We are monolithic application, and we really need to be evolving this into a micro, or at least some parts of that monolith need to be broken out into microservices. That would be something that we need to document in the technical debt. So it depends. Or we have, like, we're using synchronous communication, and that temporal coupling is really problematic, but we cannot like flip the switch immediately to move to messaging or something. So those kind of those kind of things needs to be documented on the technical debt section.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. The next question is, have you used arc42 for posterior documentation, e.g., can you use it to document an already built system prior to starting an enhancement project?
I haven't I haven't documented a system that was supposed to change. So in the sense of creating an arc42 document of the as is, and then an arc42 of the to be, so that we have the comparison and then moving towards. I haven't done that, no. And I'm not sure of the benefit that so I don't know, maybe this is beneficial, or in particular context, it's just that I'm personally not sure what will be the benefit there. Mostly from my personal experience, again, I would be really interested to hear if somebody has done this and seen the benefit of so not having the document and creating it just before the migration of that. But I'm seeing more of the benefits in arc42 in exactly the kind of interactions that we're having with people, and and how do we convey that information in an easy manner. So usually the documentation that I create tend to be few pages long, so it's not like the big enterprise documentation that I gave an example in the beginning. It's really accessible, and it's meant to be that. So I don't know whether that will be beneficial.
Maybe to have a basis for future decisions and discussions.
I mean,
I'm also not sure.
you could document that separately, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you are creating a new document about the system to be, so you are going to be building a system with certain restrictions. You could document that as part of your forces and the environment that you had. I mean, you could document this is what we had, or we had something like this in place, but we moved along because of X, Y, and Z reasons, for example. So that will be part of your quality goals. It will be part of your context. So I don't know whether a full documentation is what I'm trying to explain is benefit. As I said, I mean, that's not to say that an as is versus a to be isn't useful. Of course, doing an analysis of the as is versus the to be is always useful when you are doing migration projects. It's just I don't know whether it makes sense to establish a documentation, like full documentation of the existing system, if you are just about to change it.
Yep. Okay. I know what you mean. Yeah. Okay, thank you. The next question is, what's the point of having a risk section if the arc42 documentation is meant to be revisited only seldomly?
Well, when I say seldomly, that's not to mention that. So as I said, it's supposed to be read by people coming in, and it is supposed to be maintained. When I said seldomly, that's not to say that we just like avoid visiting arc42. As I said, it's just we avoid making ourselves, making updating arc42 a day job. So that's all I'm saying. Definitely, there will be updating this from time to time as the system evolves. Obviously, the static view and the dynamic view are going to be changing. It's just that we don't want to be changing this daily. Similarly with all
Yeah.
of the other sections. So yeah, definitely add important risks there. If you have to be, if you're updating them on a regular basis, fine. But I mean, I don't want you putting stuff there that you're going to be changing on a daily basis.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Um, yeah. In your experience, is there a lot of redundancy between the different sections?
Not not to be honest, no. There is a little bit of information carried across, but usually it's just a diagram or two, or at
Yeah.
least that's my experience. So in some sections you're presenting a summary, and then you're providing some detailed information from that. You are not redoing work, but you are going to be. It's useful to provide even within the same section, even within one the same document. Just this is what we have, and then you just expand on it. It's useful to be there. As I said, cause and effect being close together is useful. And again, this kind of perspective is useful. Instead of saying, well, given the diagram we had like 3 sections ago, now we're going to be describing it a little bit. So that
Yeah.
is less useful. You want to be able to just read it through easily and get the information you want. So that's why some duplication exists, but it's pretty limited. So as I said, from personal experience, that duplication usually tends to be diagrams. That's easy for me to solve with plant.uml because I can update the plant.uml document and it gets updated. I also know that I need to update the text accompanying that as well. So it's usually not a big effort, and it's not like I have to keep things synchronized across. It's quite not. It has not been a problem in my experience. Is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I also think so because arc42 is very hierarchy,
Yep.
and so on. You have always more detailed information, but not the same. So,
Yep.
yeah. Thank you. So, how would you structure the arc42 sections in a microservice system? One arc42 documentation for the system, one per service, a mix of this?
Well, I will say, as a rule of thumb, I will have one arc42 documentation for a product, not for when I say product, I don't
Yeah.
mean like a platform as a product and things like that. I really mean like product from the end user perspective. So I'm starting to use Spotify as a listener, and that is a product in my perspective. It doesn't matter how complicated Spotify is. So that's generally, as a rule of thumb, I'm saying. So if you are indeed Spotify and you have like a gazillion of microservices, maybe probably you want to split down into internal products that you have. So it depends. I haven't worked in a company that is that large, that it will need multiple arc42 documentations. Well, I've worked in companies that need 2 or 3 probably, but
Mhm.
that's the maximum that I've seen. So it depends.
I think so too. Yeah. Thank you. It was interesting. Uh, wait a moment. Okay. How to make sure that the information is not redundant if not central EA is doing this documentation, e.g. arc42 for many different projects. Maybe it's similar to the last one.
Yeah. So
Yeah. Okay.
EA enterprise architecture, right? Not,
Yeah, I think so.
yeah.
Yeah, enterprise architecture.
Well, you will have an architect doing this if there is an architect dedicated in the company. So you will have a single like voice owning this particular thing. There wouldn't be a conflict or any miscommunication or anything. So generally that part is covered a little bit by that. As well, from the redundancy aspect of things, there is specifically my favorite, one of my favorite sections, okay, because I like quite like some sections of arc42, which is the conceptual integrity. So when you are developing this, if you are noticing patterns, really you should think about probably moving those patterns to conceptual integrity. So I've been trying to see if there is a shared way, or a common way, sorry, not a shared way, a common way of doing things, and trying to like document that. That's a good candidate to move there. So that probably helps. But then again, when you don't have an enterprise architect, and when as a team, like, it's sometimes I can understand that it's easy to skip. What I will say and what I've seen is that tend to have people wear the architect hat, even though they are not particularly, I mean, they're not specifically an architect. And this can be a joint role, and you can rotate across between team leads or whoever it makes sense within the company that you have, and maintain this as a collectively, making sure that the documentation is okay and that all of the decisions are made accordingly. But this is really dependent on your particular context. So definitely having some so if you have multiple teams, communication across the teams between about what goes there. So don't have bits of so smaller sections being owned by one team and smaller other subsections owned by another team and so on. Avoid doing that. If you are going to be maintaining that, maintain this collectively. And if you do have some architects, it doesn't have to be an enterprise architect. It's just that somebody that owns the architecture, well, someone or a team of architects that own that the architecture for a product specifically, and have them own this particular effort of writing and maintaining this. But
Okay.
smaller teams can still do this, as I mentioned. It's not a problem. I've seen this
Okay.
work.
Okay.
I mean, it's yeah.
Yeah, I think it's hard to answer this question because it depends on so many things. It's not really arc42 problem.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There is a new question. How do you document coding conventions and patterns and keep sure that the whole team is up to date? How do you inform about breaking changes?
Hmm. Well, coding conventions and patterns, again, that's the conceptual integrity section. I If something is important, if something is repeated across your code base, and it's difficult to change, or it's going to become expensive to change, definitely make sure that that's there. From the perspective of enforcing what is on that section across the teams, across all of the teams that are involved in building this product, I will say that it makes sense for the architect to be very hands-on. So I have very strong opinions about how well, about having an architect that is a hands-on architect. So the architect can usually enforce those kind of decisions through either a code reviews, or working with the team, or pairing, or in this swarm that is developing those products, or periodic reviews of the code base. There are different ways, there are different tools that you can use to enforce those patterns across your teams.
Okay. Would you, because this was the last question, because of coding conventions, if you use a lint tool or static analysis tools like, I don't know, TSLint or BMD or whatever, would you also document it in arc42, the rules for the coding for the tools, or is it documentation for you that we have a configuration file where we can find the tools, the rules? You know
Uh,
what I mean?
yes, I do. Yes, of course. What I will say is that I generally wouldn't document the conventions themselves. So
Okay.
this particular section is for, as I mentioned, the important pieces. So, for example, it will be, how do we use metadata in the messages that we are having in our system? So, what exactly do we put there, and why? So what do we put there in order for us to be able to debug? I will document the process of debugging, for example. Again, that is, it has specific needs and specific process that you're following. So all of those patterns should be documented there. But as I'm hope that I'm conveying is that these are like really important and not small, basically, to change. Now, having said that, having a linter, of course, or something that enforces certain conventions, and certain conventions is definitely useful. I will document that fact so that we have conventions that are shared across the company there that we are going to be, I mean, we can use. But having said that, again, a final point, I've seen people being really picky about code, like some nitty details about code. So maybe it's worth having your different teams have different code conventions. I mean, if it's small stuff, it's not that big of a problem. So if it's bigger stuff, so if it's impacting some workflows like debugging, for example, that's probably not something that you want to like have different teams behave differently, because that will break when at the integration point. So something happens in between bounded context A and bounded context B. If these two teams use different conventions for metadata or whatever, maybe the process of debugging will be breaking down. That is something that as an architect you need to enforce. But whether somebody uses, I don't know, I cannot think quickly of an example right now on top of my head, but if it's something specific to with code that you can just change your linter and then it just like everything happens, it's probably something that you can refactor quickly.
Yep.
So I don't know, it depends.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. This was really my last question now from us. Do you have anything to say, last words, or how do you feel? How was it for you?
I really enjoyed this talk. I really enjoyed talking about arc42 and especially some sections as I hope I conveyed. I really like the conceptual integrity one, as I keep mentioning. So really, I enjoyed this talk. Thank you very much. I really liked presenting about this subject.
Okay, thank you to you. And Fabian or Martin, do you have last words, or can we close it?
I think we can close now. Thank you, Savvas. Thank you very much.
Thank you
for coming here.
Okay. Yeah, then thank you. Have a nice day all, and yeah, I hope we see each other soon in the next meetup. Thank you. Bye.